Right, okay, now this is the lesson on how to answer each question on paper 2 for Edexcel GCSE. Now remember, this is only just a guidance and it may not follow the same ways in which other schools do it, but this is the way in which we do it and the way in which we should approach the exams for regardless of which year group you are. So paper 2 is the Richard and John paper and the American West paper. Now this is probably one of the more demanding papers because you have to do 2 different time periods in one exam. So you've got to remember a lot of information. They're worth 20% each. Now they're worth 64 marks overall, so 32 marks each. It's a 1 hour and 45-minute paper with 2 separate exam papers. Now the thing is with this exam is you will not be told when to change paper. So the advice I reckon is you spend about 50 minutes on American West and 55 minutes on Richard and John. Now you can choose whatever order you want to do it in. So you can start with American West or you start with Richard and John. So what questions do you have on paper 2? Now the good thing about Richard and John is that the questions you have on Richard and John are questions that you have done before. American West, on the other hand, there are some trigger words which we are used to explaining, but they are 3 exam questions that are very different. So the Richard and John one's very easy to go through, and I won't spend too long on going on that because paper 1 PowerPoint and the paper 1 YouTube presentation does the same thing. But Richard and John, so you have a describe 2 features question, an explain question, and a how far do you agree question. The only difference with Richard and John's 16 marker is there is no spag marks. With American West, you have an explain 2 consequences question, a narrative account analysing events question, and importance of one event to another, in which you do 2 of those, but you have a choice out of 3. So I'm going to go through some questions and then show you some example answers that would have done very well at GCSE because they are real examples of GCSE exams. First, we'll start with Richard and John. So like I said in the previous paper 1 show, describe 2 features as a 4 marker. 2 extended facts, lots of key words, about 4 to 5 minutes, focus on the question and do not overwrite. You've got one example here, describe 2 features of the Magna Carta. Now, one feature of the Magna Carta was that barons couldn't be taxed over £100 at a time, 1 mark. I will tick where these marks are happening, just so you know from an examiner's point of view that this is what they would do. There. This reduced barons' fears in having their land taken off them due to not being able to pay their taxes. 2 marks, done. A second key feature of the Magna Carta was that the Church of England should be set free and is owned by no one. That's their mark. This reduced John's control of the church and meant that the church couldn't be punished in an interdict or excommunication. Brilliant. Now again, the key thing about this response is the key words: taxes, land, barons, Church of England, interdict, excommunicate. There's some real key words there that we can use in this response to give it the 4 out of 4. This question, remember though, is very easy to get for if you do it in time, focus on the question, and you know the facts about it. The second question is your explain question. Now again, very similar to paper 1, it's the exact same approach. 3 Peel paragraphs. This question is on all 3 papers, Germany, Richard and John, and medicine, so there is no excuse not to know the structure. Like before, don't just use the bullet points, okay? I look at the question that I've put on here, explain why Richard was able to secure his power. The bullet points don't actually help too much. If anything, they hinder and it caused some weak responses because of this. Make sure that you're rewording the question to help your explanation and don't do a conclusion in the explain question. So the question you've got here is a rough example of 1 paragraph of the 12 marker. If you see in the corner, this got 12 out of 12. One reason that Richard was able to secure his power when he became king was because of his brothers, particularly John. So first of all, this person is given a very clear point. Then they go on to their evidence. A piece of evidence to support this is the strength of John's and Geoffrey's claim. Geoffrey's claim was very weak as he didn't have rights to the throne through primogeniture as he was illegitimate. John's claim was weak as John didn't have the respect from the people or did he have the throne through primogeniture, as he was not the eldest brother. Okay, this that bit there. All of this is the evidence, and then you've got the last bit there, which is the explain. This allowed Richard to secure the throne as his brother's claim were not strong enough to overpower him. Okay, point, evidence, explain. If they just did that as this paragraph, probably would get away with it. Another piece of evidence to support this is Richard gave John titles and parts of Normandy which prevented John from becoming king whilst he was away on crusade. Another clear piece of evidence. That's what we need to understand for this 12 marker, is that if the evidence is good, the explanation will do itself. Okay, it's really clear to do the explanation if your evidence is strong, secure, and factually very detailed. Then you'll get the 16 marker. Now, just ignore one part of this. I'm just going to, it's not worth 20 marks. Okay, remember this is worth 16 marks, this one. It's 20 marks in the medicine paper. So this is worth 16 marks, but it's a big chunk. It's half of the marks of the Richard and John paper. Okay, don't do both again. You get a choice. Don't just write about the bullet points if you don't get it. Okay. Now, there's two questions here. These were dream questions last year. Financial gain was the main reason for men joining the English crusading army. How far do you agree? You may use the following: debt and religion. And King John's use of arbitrary power was the main reason for his worsening relationship with the barons in the years 1209 to 14. How far do you agree? The big thing I noticed with this question last year was that a lot of people chose this one, this top one. But when they got to this question, a lot of people struggled with the concept of arbitrary power. Again, only do the question if you're very confident of the direct wording. And like paper 1, you agree, give 3 detailed reasons why you agree and link it to the question, and give a ranking: strong knowledge, less strong. Overall, at the end of the paragraph, what's your strongest piece of evidence and why, and what's the weakest piece of evidence and why, to help you answer the question. Then you disagree with the statement. So you give 3 detailed reasons why you disagree and explain how it links to the question. Give ranking, how important is that? And then strongest piece, weakest piece. And then your G-on conclusion. The best thing for this is just to show you an example. Now, the one thing you would have noticed with the 16 markers is obviously they are very long, okay? And that's the point. But it's not about the quantity in which you're writing. You could write 8 pages and get 16 marks, and someone else could write 3 pages and get the same. This person is obviously very secure with this question. So one reason to agree with the statement is whilst on crusade, any debts the future crusaders had would be stopped until they returned. This evidence is strong. That is a good indication of how you do that part there. Okay, this evidence is strong. That's good. Okay, because going crusade meant that people have more time to avoid paying their debts. That's their explanation. That's 2 ticks right there. Another reason to agree with the statement is anything that crusaders raided whilst on crusade, they can keep for themselves. Okay, evidence. This evidence is very strong because it showed that financial gain was appealing to the crusaders, as they could use their lootings to pay for previous debts. That's their explanation. My final reason why to agree with the statement is if a person went on crusade, they could avoid paying the Saladin tithe. That's their evidence. Okay. Therefore, the evidence is strong because they would no longer have to pay the Saladin tithe and could earn money whilst on crusade to pay for it once they returned. Overall, financial gain was very appealing to the crusaders, as if they were successful, they would return with more money and riches than they had in the beginning. That's a little overall section. It doesn't do the strongest and weakest argument, but it gives an end to that paragraph. Then they do their disagree section. However, there's some aspects of going on crusade which are more appealing. Good. For example, the Pope during the time of the Third Crusade offered a full indulgence to anyone that went and fought. A full indulgence allowed people to go straight to heaven to avoid spending time in purgatory. That's brilliant evidence. Evidence is very strong because during the reign of Richard and John, England was highly religious, and going to heaven after death would be the ultimate achievement. That's their explanation. Another reason to disagree with the statement is the respect that a person could gain through going on crusade. Most men during the medieval period could only gain land and respect through primogeniture. However, going on crusade allowed younger sons to earn land and respect from the Lord and potentially move up higher in the feudal system. That's brilliant evidence again. This evidence is strong because moving up the feudal system would lead to owning more land and therefore more money, something that appealed to potential crusaders. Again, another really strong piece of explanation. Going on, this person finishes off, and then in conclusion, I disagree with the statement because the promise of a full indulgence by the Pope was appealing. This is an okay conclusion. It probably wasn't the strongest, but it did the job. It answered the question. If it had more balance, then it probably would have got 16, but this actually got 15 out of 16. So it shows a very clear response and shows you the structure that you should be keeping to in a 16 marker. Right, now the second section is American West. Now, as I've said, you can do this in any order you want. So you might want to start with American West in the real thing. But the American West questions are very difficult to get your heads around, and it is practice that makes this more effective. So the first question is explain two consequences. Now, what needs to be understood is that consequence can be good or bad, short-term and long-term, or long-term, sorry. The consequence can also be focused on a number of groups. Now, you must look at the wording of the question. Now, this here is an example from the first GCSE, and the question was, explain two consequences of the gold rush for migration. So what this person's done, they gave a consequence and they explain it with evidence to back it up. Okay. Now, the key thing for this is the American West paper, you have lots of time to plan. All right. Getting your head around these questions is really important to succeeding. So spending a little bit of time planning will allow you that freedom to be able to develop the question. This got 7 out of 8 altogether, and this person wrote, migration to the West increased due to the gold rush of 1849. However, due to the vast amounts of migrants, there weren't actually much gold to be claimed. This led to prospectors having to become farmers. I mean, they're talking here about how people failed because of the lack of gold. This was a good thing as the land in California was very fertile. This then led to many prospectors setting up home in the West, thus leading to many towns in the West. The reason this was a good response is because they talked to what it led to. So given a consequence that there wasn't much gold and people became farmers, then they explained this consequence, saying what it would lead to. The consequence too said mass migration to the West also led to many early deaths. That's the consequence. These deaths were caused either by the long journey from the East to the West by not taking enough supplies, for example, or the awful journey over the Black Hills. Or many deaths were caused by people not knowing how to deal with the harsh weather conditions, as it was ridiculously hot in the summer and extremely cold in the winter, thus leading to many deaths. That person's got it spot on. Okay, it was given 7 out of 8, but they talked about how it was deaths with the journey. You could also say consequence of the gold rush. I mean, this second one got 3 out of 4, but you could potentially give examples of certain groups. A better response for the gold rush and migration, you could have talked about racism, law and order, those sorts of things, okay? But the consequence question, you give a consequence and you explain what it leads to. Explain it in 5 lines or so. Just keep aware that consequences can be a range of things, basically what happened because of an event. Now, the narrative account question is one that's caused lots of debate. The narrative account question is a lot simpler than what it's intended to be, okay? The wording of the question tends to confuse people the most. So the question states, write a narrative account analysing the key events of Mormon migration in the years 46 to 47. Now, this is one that you've done in lesson. Now, what needs to be understood with this is that the question needs to be a chronologically ordered event. Okay, you need to talk about what happened in the beginning, what that led to, what happened in the middle, what that led to, and what happened at the end, and what that led to. Now, my advice for this question is you have to do a little timeline. You have to spend a good 5 minutes planning this response before you go any further. You've got to plan by writing a timeline, getting your facts straight, and then write the response. This question is very hard just to write from the top of your head. So in my sort of understanding, I think the best structure for this would be, firstly, give an event and give evidence. This led to. Secondly, give an event and give evidence. This led to. Lastly, give an event and give evidence. This led to. You can do this as one big paragraph, or 3 separate ones. My personal preference would be to do 3 separate paragraphs because it shows that chronological balance, but it's at the preference of the candidate, okay? Now this person's only done it as sort of 2, well they actually did 3 paragraphs, but the 3rd paragraph wasn't correct. But this is a perfect example of the narrative account question because it shows that process of chronology. The first event of Mormon migration was reasons for the Mormons being pushed out of the town in 1846. The Mormons were a religious group that practiced polygamy. This was discriminated against as not normal and not God's plans. The prejudice against Mormons led to them feeling unwelcome, and as a consequence, the Mormons decided to leave and settle somewhere else. The Mormons chose Salt Lake Valley as it has one of the only places that would not be discriminated against. However, due to the Mormons being pushed out, they had to leave earlier than expected. This event led to earlier travel to Salt Lake Valley. I've highlighted there the analytical phrases. This led to as a consequence, however. Really strong first paragraph sets the story. A second event was the journey to Salt Lake Valley led by Brigham Young. Young was well organised and prepared, and he first set up winter quarters so they wouldn't have to travel during winter and risk death. He also sent out an advance party to mark water sources and plant crops, so if they ran out of food, it wouldn't be an issue. Lastly, he also split groups into equal ranges, age ranges, skills, and each group had one leader to avoid confusion and make the groups more likely to survive. As a result, the Mormons successfully arrived in Salt Lake Valley, avoiding all mistakes the Donner Party made. This event led to the creation of Salt Lake City due to the success of Brigham Young. Clear story, a clear narrative that shows how each event led to another. Keep the narrative account simple, with specific factual detail and in chronological order. And the last question, explain the importance of something to something. Now there's a choice of 3 questions here. You've got to answer 2 of them. Okay. So this, you can see on the side of the screen there's 3 questions. The importance of changes in ranches to the cowboys' way of life, the importance of the exodus movement to the growth of settlement, and the importance of the extermination of the buffalo for the Plains Indians' way of life. Spend about 15 minutes on each of these with a couple of minutes planning time. The key thing here is linking the 2 things together. Why is one thing important to the other? So you must keep rewording the question. Now you can either do 3 peel paragraphs or 2 peel paragraphs. It's up to you. But what is important is your evidence is specific. Your explanation must link to the importance of one thing to another. It is very difficult to structure. Now I have 1 8 out of 8 response, and this was based on the first question here, the importance of the changes in ranching of the cowboys' way of life. This person structured it differently, but they've done it well. So during the Great Die-Up of 1866, temperatures reached minus 55 degrees. Straight away, there's a slight error there because it wasn't in 1866. So the thick snow meant the cowboys and cattle ranchers could not reach the cattle out on the ranches. This led to a large amount of cattle dying in the plains, making it clear that huge-scale ranches were not effective because of the unpredictability of the plains weather. The Great Die-Up signified the end of huge-scale ranches and therefore affected the lives of the cowboy. This resulted in smaller demand for cowboys, so the long drives to the west were becoming more uncommon as smaller, more local ranches were increasing. This change in ranching is important for cowboys' way of life, as they now received less income and lived in small bunkhouses on a small-scale ranch, as opposed to constantly moving around and spending money, something that the cowboys had previously enjoyed. The first part is their evidence. The second part is their explanation, their linking of one thing to another. Then they go again. Before the Great Die-Up, cowboys would go on the long drive, earn their money, and be able to spend their money in the next town, especially cow towns such as Abilene that they arrived at. This led to drunken shootouts between cowboys and settlers who had drunken fights over prostitutes and gambling. However, after the Great Die-Up, as the need for cowboys lessened, many remained on small ranches and didn't experience the experiences they had before the events of the Great Die-Up. Therefore, the changes in cattle ranching were important to the lives of cowboys because not only were they not needed anymore, they also didn't have as much freedom to live life away from the ranch. Very clear response. 8 out of 8. It's got lots of knowledge, but more importantly, they reword the question at the end. Very clear, to the point. It shows they know their stuff about changes in ranching for the cowboy's way of life. The challenging thing with this question is you don't get any stimulus points. But my advice would be follow the structure that we've mentioned there, 3 PL paragraphs or 2 PL paragraphs. This candidate has actually gone down the 2 PL paragraphs, okay? So that's a lot to take in there, but that's gone through all 6 question types of Richard and John and American West. Structure is key and will allow you to access those top levels when you get into the exam. It's all well and good knowing the knowledge, but unless you know how to represent that knowledge in a structured format, then it will become difficult. So keeping to these will allow you that structure to access the top levels and really develop your GCSE grade to as high as you possibly want it.